A husband was convicted of murdering his wife and young daughter in their own home. The evidence presented in court was strong enough to secure a guilty verdict. But within a few years, that same conviction was overturned. The case that once seemed resolved was suddenly reopened. Investigators were forced to reconsider what they believed had already been proven. Key evidence was questioned. Timelines that had been accepted were re-examined, and the central question returned again. Did he actually commit the crime, or had something been misunderstood? If the original case was flawed, what had been missed the first time? And when the case went back to court, would the outcome remain the same? The case began in 2000 in Palmerston, New Zealand, when a violent crime was discovered inside a family home. Mark Lundy's wife, Christine Lundy, and their young daughter, Amber, were both found dead at the scene. The condition of the scene immediately indicated that this was a brutal and deliberate attack, rather than a random incident. There were clear signs that the crime had taken place inside the home and not elsewhere. Nothing suggested forced entry, which raised early questions about how the offender had gained access. This indicated that whoever was responsible was either known to the victims or able to enter without resistance. Investigators began documenting the layout of the home and the positioning of evidence to understand how the attack had occurred. The nature of the injuries confirmed that both victims were targeted directly. There was no indication that anything had been taken from the property, which reduced the likelihood of a robbery motive. This shifted the investigation toward understanding relationships, movements, and access. At the time the crime was discovered, Mark Lundy was not at the house. This immediately placed focus on reconstructing his movements and determining whether his absence aligned with the timeline of the attack. At the time of the attack, Mark Lundy was in Wellington, approximately 140 kilometers away from the family home in Palmerston North. He had traveled there for work and was staying overnight, which initially supported his alibi. The crime was believed to have occurred late in the evening while he was expected to be away from the scene. However, investigators began examining whether the timeline allowed for the possibility of travel between the two locations. This meant assessing whether he could have driven from Wellington to Palmerston North and returned without being detected. The distance and required travel time became a critical point in the investigation. Attention focused on whether there were gaps in his movements that could not be fully accounted for. Investigators reviewed his travel records, timing of communications, and the sequence of events surrounding his trip. As this information was analyzed, questions emerged whether the timeline he provided was as precise as it appeared. Because there was no sign of forced entry at the home, his relationship to the victims remained a key factor. This combination of a theoretically possible travel window and his direct connection to the household increased suspicion. At that stage, the investigation shifted from verifying an alibi to actively testing whether it could be challenged. As the investigation progressed, the case against Mark Lundy was built on a combination of forensic findings and timeline analysis. One of the most significant pieces of evidence presented was biological material found on his clothing. This material was examined by forensic specialists and was identified by the prosecution as brain tissue. The prosecution argued that this tissue originated from his wife and linked him directly to the attack. This claim became a central part of the case presented in court. Alongside this, the timeline remained critical to the investigation. Investigators argued that despite being in Wellington, it was still possible for him to travel to Palmerston North and return within the time frame. This interpretation challenged the reliability of his alibi. The prosecution combined the forensic findings with the reconstructed travel timeline to build a consistent narrative. They argued that both the physical evidence and the timing supported his involvement. When presented together, these elements were accepted by the court as sufficient proof. Based on this combination of forensic analysis and timeline reconstruction, Mark Lundy was convicted of the murders. Although the conviction appeared strong, the case did not remain settled. During the appeal process, attention returned to the evidence that had led to the original verdict. The biological material found on Mark Lundy's clothing became a central point of challenge. The defense argued that the identification of this material as brain tissue was not as certain as initially presented. At the same time, the timeline used in the first trial was closely examined. The prosecution's case had relied on a narrow time window that required precise travel between Wellington and Palmerston North. This timeline was challenged as being too restrictive and dependent on assumptions rather than confirmed timing. Questions were raised about whether the estimated time of death had been accurately determined. If that timing was incorrect, the entire travel-based theory became significantly weaker. These combined issues created doubt about whether the case had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. As a result, the conviction was considered unsafe and was overturned. What had once appeared to be a conclusive case was now understood to have critical weaknesses in both evidence and timing. After the conviction was overturned, the investigation had to be rebuilt from the ground up. This required investigators to re-examine both the forensic evidence and the timeline independently. The biological material found on Mark Lundy's shirt was reanalyzed using updated forensic techniques. New expert reviews focused on whether the material could be accurately identified and whether earlier conclusions were reliable. At the same time, the timeline of the crime was reassessed without relying on the assumptions used in the first trial. This included re-evaluating the estimated time of death and the feasibility of travel between Wellington and Palmerston North. Investigators examined whether the original timeline had been too narrow or based on incomplete interpretation. Additional analysis was carried out on communication records, travel data, and the sequence of events before and after the crime. This aimed to determine whether the case could still be supported when tested under stricter scrutiny. The focus was no longer just on presenting a theory, but on confirming that each part of the case could stand independently. As the reinvestigation progressed, prosecutors prepared to present the case again using revised evidence and interpretation. This set the stage for a second trial, where the same crime would be examined under a new framework. When the case returned to court, it was presented with revised forensic interpretation and a restructured timeline. The biological material found on Mark Lundy's shirt was again presented, but this time supported by updated expert analysis. The prosecution maintained that the material was brain tissue and argued that the new testing strengthened their original conclusion. At the same time, the timeline of the crime was adjusted based on revised estimates of when the attack had occurred. This reduced the margin of uncertainty that had been challenged in the first trial. The prosecution argued that even with the revised timing, it was still possible for him to travel from Wellington to Palmerston North and return. This restored the feasibility of the travel window that had been questioned earlier. The case presented to the jury combined the updated forensic evidence with a more carefully constructed timeline. The argument was no longer based on a single interpretation, but on multiple elements that supported each other. The defense continued to challenge the reliability of the forensic conclusions and the assumptions behind the timeline. However, after reviewing the revised case, the court again found the evidence sufficient. Mark Lundy was convicted for a second time. Following the second conviction, the case was understood through a combination of revised forensic interpretation and a reconstructed timeline. In the original trial, the prosecution relied on a narrow time window, suggesting the crime occurred late at night. This timeline was challenged because it required a highly precise and difficult travel sequence between Wellington and Palmerston North. During the appeal, this became one of the key weaknesses in the case. In the retrial, the estimated time of death was reassessed and shifted earlier based on updated expert analysis. This created a wider and more realistic window in which the crime could have occurred. With this adjustment, the prosecution argued that it was feasible for Mark Lundy to travel to the home and return without contradiction. This revised timeline removed the earlier pressure that had made the original theory difficult to sustain. At the same time, the forensic evidence, including the biological material identified as brain tissue, was presented again with updated interpretation. Mark Lundy did not confess to the crime and has continued to deny involvement. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment, accepting that the combined evidence proved the case beyond reasonable doubt. While the conviction stands, the motive was not definitively established, and aspects of the evidence and interpretation continue to be debated.